Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement and the future of digital trade governance. This is an event that is organized by Trade Policy Exchange, which is a multi-stakeholder platform that aims at promoting an open debate between institutional entities, governments, civil society, business, and academia. And it organizes events across different trade and sustainable development issues. Today's webinar would not have been possible without my fellow co-organizers, Dr. Nicolas Kohler-Suzuki, who is a co-founder of Trade Policy Exchange, as well as Professor Franziska Sacker of the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, to whom goes my profound gratitude. I'm also extremely grateful that our four amazing panelists have kindly agreed to join us today and help us better understand what the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, also known as DEPA, is, and how important this agreement can be for the future of digital trade governance. So today with us, we have Deborah Helm, Executive Director of the Asian Trade Center, Henry Gao, Professor of Law at the Singapore Management University, Stephanie Honey, Principal Consultant at Honey Consulting, and last but not least, Neha Mishra, Lecturer at the Australian National University College of Law. So in the first part of this webinar, each of the four panelists will provide a brief presentation on a few key aspects related to the negotiation, the structure, scope, and significance of the DEPA. And the second part of the webinar will be devoted to a Q&A session. So if any of you wants to ask a question to the panelists, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to write your question. And if there are questions that you already see that are written in the Q&A, you can also like them so that we will know which questions are much more interesting to the whole audience, and we will ask them to the panelists. So why did we feel that it was necessary to host a webinar on the DEPA? Why we should talk about this agreement? We identified two main reasons. The first one is that this, compared to other agreements that are out there that discuss digital trade, this is a relatively new agreement. It was signed only a year ago by 3 countries, Chile, New Zealand, and Singapore, and it has actually entered into force only between 2 of them, Singapore and New Zealand, in January of 2021. And so we felt that not much has been said yet about such an interesting agreement. The second reason is that it is an interesting agreement because it is the first of its kind. It's an agreement that is entirely dedicated to measures affecting trade in the digital economy. And so as such, we felt that it was necessary to discuss a little bit more about this agreement. So because we think that not everyone that is attending this session today may be familiar with the agreement, we have kindly asked Deborah Helms to be the first to speak and to provide us a little bit of a more background information on DEPA and to highlight especially its key features and what she thinks is the significance of this agreement for digital trade governance. So Deborah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very much honored to be here and to share with you today. Let me just get my screen open and share this for you, and then we can go through it in more detail. So, like there. Yes? Okay. All right. So I'm happy today to talk about DEPA and digital trade in general. This region in Asia has been at the forefront of discussing many of these digital agreements, or rather, I should say, anchoring certain kinds of digital commitments into different kinds of trade agreements. Now, why have they done that? Well, in part because many Asian governments have realized that having a sort of free-for-all for digital trade and e-commerce is actually problematic, that having no rules is not helpful for governments, and it's also not helpful for firms. So many times when I have these conversations, I'll get, especially government officials who will say, but actually firms like chaos and they like to have no rules. I would say actually not, most of them dislike no rules. No rules is very uncertain. No rules is very risky. So having a certain amount of guardrails is crucial for firms to survive and flourish. And most critically, as long as we have rules that go in the same general direction, that avoids the risk of regulatory fragmentation. And regulatory fragmentation in the digital space is a real problem, becoming an even bigger problem over time. And that regulatory fragmentation will favor large firms over small firms. That creates a problem for many governments who believe that by having country-specific, domestic-level laws on digital, that they will actually benefit their smaller firms. But in fact, the net result is so much chaos that only the largest, most well-endowed firms can navigate that kind of regulatory inconsistency. And at a certain point, it actually gets too big even for the largest firms. So they will struggle to serve as different markets with different digital rules in place. And so where do we see governments in this region, especially anchoring these rules? They're doing it in existing free trade agreements. They are revising past free trade agreements to update the e-commerce chapter or the digital trade rules, or they're creating, like DEPA, a standalone agreement just for digital. So there's a lot of ways that you could achieve this outcome of having more regulatory coherence. But one way that many governments in Asia are doing it is to anchor it in one way or another in a trade agreement. Most of these trade agreement deals, either in an FTA, in revisions to a past FTA, or in a digital only agreement, include at least the following kinds of commitments. Paperless trading is a regular commitment that we see in Asia. Lots of rules around electronic signatures, electronic authorization. It's not always well implemented, but the idea is certainly important. And anyone who's tried to do any legal documentation in COVID will say, wouldn't it be great if it actually worked well? Lots of discussions about logistics costs. Here in Asia, we have heavy focus and sustained focus over years actually on logistics, but now movement to e-commerce delivery, small size, small value shipments, not 40-foot containers, but what can we do to facilitate e-commerce small size packages? Payments are often embedded in here. There's no point in doing the digital economy if you can't get paid, if you can't settle your bills. Having something in there on online consumer protection is a frequent feature in many of these trade agreements. Having some kind of rules around cross-border data flows, and I know we're going to discuss this at length here in a minute, but something around data, because you can't have the digital economy flourish if we don't have data rules that are at least aligned with one another. But at the same time, protect personal information. So all of these agreements in one form or another contain both of those parts. Often rules around location of cloud service computing. We call that data localization in trade agreement language, but it's about where do you have to host information? And then typically, but not always, you need to make sure that there's regular engagement with stakeholders because this is a fast moving space. So those are elements that are in a lot of trade deals. There are three in particular that I'm going to mention. And the reason that I'm going to do three instead of just one is because some of you may have more or less familiarity with one of these other agreements. And so it helps you sort of understand the relationship between them. So the agreement in Asia that really started driving many of these new digital commitments was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, renamed to the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, or CPTPP. It includes 7 countries here in Asia that are currently active members. And then 3 of them became part of this digital-only agreement called DEPA. And 2 of them are also involved right now in a digital economy agreement, a DEA, Singapore and Australia. But there are also DEAs that Singapore is busy negotiating with South Korea, soon to be launched, with the UK and with others. So we have lots of different ways in which you might anchor these kinds of commitments. So let me just show you quickly what is embedded in all of these. So we've pulled out 23 different areas, and you can see that across these 3 agreements, and again, remember that they're basically the same kinds of members, we have similar kinds of commitments. So the DEA is on the left-hand column. That's the Digital Economy Agreement, Singapore and Australia. The DEA, as you can see, is more comprehensive. And it's more comprehensive for a number of reasons, but I would say one of them is it builds on an existing free trade agreement. So it can take advantage of the FTA structure. And these are 2 countries that are at the cutting edge of the digital economy, and especially digital economy agreements. They are also aligned in the WTO's Joint Sector Initiative as co-leads. So these are countries that see themselves as quite advanced in digital economy, and they have a very extensive agreement. A slightly less extensive agreement is in DEPA. the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is what we're talking about today. And the reason for I think the slightly less ambitious approach is that DEPA has a different model. DEPA is a standalone agreement. It's not backed by an FTA. It's intended to be made in modules. Each of these commitments that I note here is a module. And the idea with the module is, in order to get better consistency, if we use the same modular language, either in whole, you join DEPA, or in part, you take a module from DEPA and you stick it into your FTA, we would have greater harmonization or alignment across different regions. So the DEPA commitments, also extensive, but a little bit less than the DEA, because it doesn't have that whole FTA framework. It's got different kinds of countries with different kinds of ambition. And then the last column here, because I think many of you may be more familiar with it, is the CPTPP, to discuss where the CPTPP language came from. Now, the CPTPP, of course, was much earlier. And the first negotiations, it feels like forever ago to me at the moment, but the original TPP was finished in January of 2016. So we're talking in digital terms like a lifetime ago, frankly. I mean, that's how fast these things move. So the CPTPP is got some very useful and very important commitments, but is also thinner, I would describe, than some of these more recent deals like DEPA and DEA. But they all build on each other. And that's the whole point for me of the digital economy agreements, is to create that kind of harmonization, alignment, consistency, use the language that makes you happiest, but moves everybody in the same general direction. And so again, DEPA does a number of things that are useful. There's a few things that are missing. So submarine cables, for example, not in DEPA, but is in the DEA. Part of that has to do with geography. Singapore and Australia have a lot of submarine cables. We have fewer between DEPA parties. The location of computing facilities was more, for financial services, was more controversial in the DEPA agreement at the time because it was building on CPTPP. So we have a number of variations between these, but overall, the same kinds of commitments keep coming up in all of these agreements. It has to do, again, with where are we at? And even if I put a tick box and I say, well, they both have this, they may not have so to the same depth. So we may have some that are more about cooperation than actually hard language, hard legal language or binding commitments. So they may all be embedded in the agreement, but the extent and the depth of that is thinner. And in particular, I would say DEPA happens to be a little bit more about cooperative language and less about hard binding legal language, because again, think about where it comes from. We're going to make a module, and then you'll take that module and put it in different settings. So we need to make sure that it's flexible so that it can be adjusted depending on who the members are that want to use that language. It tends to be less binding with less between members who have less experience working together. So the variation also comes from whether it's a standalone agreement, it's embedded in an FTA, it's intended to be replicated elsewhere. So there's lots of different ways. And what I think is great about, in my view, DEPA, DEA, CPTPP, and others, there are lots of different ways to get where you want to go. And so the goal, I think, is by many of the governments in this region is how can we consistently achieve the same approach, even if we have different variations between these agreements. And let me, because I promised that I would keep it short, let me stop there. And I am delighted to listen to my fellow panelists and take questions from all of you about DEPA in particular. And about the modular approach and whether that's proven to be successful or will likely be successful. We don't know, it's early days, but will that be more successful than the digital economy approach? Will it be less successful? Do we need a global approach? And there's a lot of different ways, again, to do this. But I think DEPA provides an interesting model of a digital only agreement, built-in modules designed to be either added to by having new members in or importing those modules and moving them elsewhere. And so trying to develop that alignment, I find quite fascinating. And the net goal of all of this from many of the participating governments is let's make a digital alignment for the future that gets us in the direction of having the most consistent types of rules and regulations, even if we have variations on how exactly we anchor that, the general thrust is the same. So let me stop there. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah. This was a very useful presentation that gave us a little bit of an overview of what DEPA is and how kind of like it fits a little bit in what's going on in the Asia Pacific region in particular with respect to the governance of digital trade. And it definitely highlights how rather unique the agreement appears to be as a standalone agreement that seems to be rather different from what was done up until now. So I will now ask Henry to actually give us his opinion on how do you think really DEPA compares to other preferential trade agreements, starting from developing on what sort of Deborah has talked about the comparison with CPTPP and DEA. Sort of how do you see sort of these agreements in the overall framework of FTAs that have been negotiated not only in the Asia Pacific, but sort of other areas of the world, and sort of where do you think kind of like this agreement fits in the overall sort of WTO framework, sort of to provide some information on that. The floor is yours, Henry.
Thank you, Marta, and thanks to Trade Policy Exchange for inviting me. And I also appreciate that Debbie gave a really comprehensive overview of DEPA, which greatly simplifies my task. So I will be talking about a few issues along the lines suggested by Marta. I will start by discussing a little bit of why we have a DEPA, what are the reasons behind, and then look at the comparison with the other agreements and also what the future will be like. So to start with, I mean, Debbie already mentioned a little bit of this from the business perspective. And I think from the government perspective, you can find both defensive reasons and also offensive reasons for Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile to start this DEPA initiative. If you look at the defensive elements, I mean, as Debbie has mentioned, you see the rise of all these new trade agreements with digital trade elements, and they all create different types of regulatory frameworks which could potentially create conflicts, and in particular the smaller countries which are parties to many different agreements. I mean, Singapore is a great example because Singapore until very recently is the only country in the world that has FTA with all of the big four economies, that is US, China, EU, and Japan. So Singapore, small countries like Singapore could find themselves being caught in the middle, this crossing regulatory matrix. So that is why the Singapore government decided to launch the DEPA negotiation. If you look at the announcement made by the MTI at the end of 2020, when they announced the coming to force of the DEPA, they said the DEPA will establish a common digital trade rules and foster cooperation on emerging issues in the digital economy. This in turn promotes interoperability between the digital systems of different countries. So the concept of interoperability features very high in the consideration of the Singapore government when they launched DEPA negotiations. And this is what I call the defensive element. On the other hand, you also have the offensive element. And on this, actually, I was reminded of something which I came across when I was researching on the new TPP agreement along with Debbie 13 years ago, when we were looking at the new TPP agreement, and I came across this very interesting quote from then Chilean ambassador to New Zealand, Juan Salazar, who was talking about the rationale behind this new agreement. He said he wanted to use this as a benchmark for trade liberalization among APEC economies and create a demonstration effect for the WTO. And then really, I think that rationale can be applied to the DEPA as well. Basically, small economies like Singapore, New Zealand, and so on, they realized that there's only so much they could do, but what they could do is providing some useful models, benchmarks, or in the words of Juan Salazar, for trade liberalization, and these give them an opportunity to shape the rules for the future. We have to keep in mind that Singapore is also one of the co-conveners for the WTO GSI negotiation on e-commerce. And I think by setting up the example of DEPA, I think they are really showing the other WTO members how you could regulate the sector, and that is a great public good. So that is the reason behind both defensive and offensive. Now, what kind of agreement is it, to answer Marta's question earlier? It is not a typical GATS Article 5 type of agreement, the so-called ERA, Economic Integration Agreement, because if you look at the requirement under the GATS, to be an ERA, you need to have a substantial sectoral coverage. The WTO currently has 12 sectors and 160 subsectors, and the DEPA only covers the digital trade sector. Even though you could argue that digital trade could cover every potential sector, but I don't think every other WTO member would buy that argument. They could see, this doesn't have substantial sectoral coverage, so this wouldn't qualify. Instead, I personally think that the DEPA is more like the telecom reference paper. So basically, it is a kind of a document which is set out a set of regulatory disciplines for a sector, and these could be something very useful because it helps basically you to develop the sector, and it doesn't really include a substantive market access commitments, which is what the traditional FTAs are about. Instead, it is about helping you to basically upgrade your regulatory framework so that you can provide a more trade facilitating environment for the development of digital trade. And that is really useful. And if you look at many of the contents of the DEPA, they are, as mentioned again by Debbie, plucked from other agreements such as the TPP and the USMCA, and you find, this group of commitments in the different modules. For example, you find provisions helping with the trade facilitation. You find provisions on the digital trade, specific provisions such as free flow of information across border, prohibition on data localization requirements, and so on. And you also have provisions aiming at building a trustworthy framework and also beefing up the security for digital trade. So all these can be found in the existing FTAs, but there are some really interesting new features in the agreement, which I think can inspire other countries. For example, there's an interesting provision on tax, which could play a part in the ongoing debate on digital services tax, or the DST. And there are also provisions on encryption, on fintech, on AI, on digital IDs, all these new emerging issues, which you don't really find even in the TPP and USMCA. And again, these are the issues that could emerge in the ongoing negotiations in the GSI, in the WTO. So I'm really glad that DEPA is, pioneering in this regard. But that said, I also think that there are things which are really lacking in the DEPA. For example, if you compare the DEPA with the TPP and USMCA, you can see that the rules on free flow of data and data localization under the DEPA are not really binding. Why? Because they are carved out from the dispute settlement procedure under the DEPA. And that is actually a step backward, I would say, compared to the USMCA, for example. The USMCA doesn't have a carve out for this. The TPP has a 2-year grace period, but the understanding is that after 2 years, everything will be subject to dispute settlement. So that, I think, is a step backward. Another thing is we don't really find language on the CBDC, which is becoming really popular in this region and the world level, except some language on prudential regulation, which could be linked to the regulation in the financial market. So that might be something that could be added in the future. And with regard to rules on privacy, which the EU and many other countries would regard as a key concern, you do not really have strong banning rules calling for members to adopt, a uniform set of privacy regulations. Instead, what you find is a soft language, which is more like the APEC cross-border privacy rules or CPPR approach. So that is something again that could be beefed up. So all these shortcomings notwithstanding, what I want to emphasize is that the DEPA, to me at least, I would regard it as a kind of a living document, a kind of an evolving document that could potentially, grow in the future, as you find, for example, with regard to the TPP, which first started, as between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, and then the US joined, and then, everybody else joined, and it kept growing. So I expect that the DEPA would be something like that, and maybe in the future, we would find, the digital trade version of a TPP that is originated from DEPA. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Henry. Again, a very informative overview of how DEPA fits into the realm of FTAs and in the WTO framework. And I thank you very much actually for mentioning the potential shortcoming or issues related to cross-border data flows, because now we have NEA that can actually help us understand a little bit more this approach that actually DEPA has taken on this particular issue that, as Deborah highlighted at the very beginning, is kind of like a key aspect and a key component of digital trade governance in general. Every single agreement, more or less, now that has been developed, especially in the last 5 years at least, touches upon in one way or the other the issue of cross-border data flows. So Neha, can you tell us a little bit more about how you think the agreement addresses this issue, and sort of like, if it undertakes a novel approach in a way, or sort of what do you think DEPA kind of like stands on this particular matter?
Thank you, Marta, and I'm also very delighted to be a part of such an exceptional panel, and thanks to Trade Policy Exchange for inviting me. To answer your question, Marta, I'll focus mostly on Module 4 of the DEPA, which deals with data issues, and there are 3 substantive areas that are covered under this module. Deborah and Henry already referred to parts of it, but I'll talk about it in more detail for some of the people who might want to know more about it. So the first area that it covers is on privacy and data protection. In the essence of these provisions is that all DEPA parties are required to adopt a framework for personal data protection or protection of personal information consistent with international standards and guidelines. As Henry mentioned, there are no specified international standards or guidelines. And in fact, the very infamous footnote from the TPP was adopted into the DEPA, which essentially allows all parties to adopt different kinds of regulatory frameworks, whether they are co-regulatory or whether they are based on voluntary standards, or whether they are more comprehensive privacy frameworks or sectoral frameworks. And that had created a lot of angst in the civil society, but that has also been retained in the DEPA. But there are also other provisions which are relatively, one can say, improvements over what was there in the CPTPP. For instance, the provisions on non-discrimination and transparency are binding. And also there is a much more extensive evaluation of interoperability mechanism, including acknowledging possible multi-stakeholder approaches to, or more co-regulatory approaches to being able to enable interoperability of data flows and interoperability of privacy regimes, including recognizing the relevance of data protection benchmarks, data protection trust marks, although there is no binding provision to that effect. The second area is data flows. And the third area is data localization. Henry already spoke about it in some detail, but let me take you through some of the relevant aspects of these provisions. It's very similar to in fact, the language is identical to the CPTPP. Essentially, the provision on data flows requires that all DEPA members allow the free flow of data for the conduct of digital trade, and data localization essentially prohibits DEPA members to impose data localization as a condition of market access. Now, both these provisions are subject to an exception for legitimate public policy objectives, which is not defined in the DEPA like the CPTPP. So it is an open provision, but there are two conditions to it. One is that the exception, so the first condition is that the measure should not be, so if you are imposing a measure which is required for legitimate public policy reasons, one is it should not be arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. For people familiar with WTO law, it's very similar to the chapeau of the general exceptions in GATT and GATS. And the second is that it should not be more restrictive than what is required to achieve that particular public policy objective. Again, people familiar with WTO law can draw parallels with the TBT regime here as well. Now, there has been a lot of discussion around the interpretation of exceptions since the first draft of TPP was leaked, the e-commerce chapter. And I'll not go into all the niceties, but I wanted to focus on one point, which is that the exception and the provisions more broadly should be understood in context of the larger orientation of the DEPA, which Deborah and Henry highlighted very well, which is that it is more about building consensus and cooperative mechanisms between the parties to DEPA. And in that regard, I think the module on data flows should not be seen in isolation, but in respect of all the other modules, whether it's a module on online safety and security, which is module 5, I think, module 8 on artificial intelligence and fintech, emerging technologies, module 9 on data innovation. These all modules provide a framework for building trust. And we know that having trust and regulatory consensus or some kind of cooperation is so essential to building data flows. So the orientation is quite different. Rather than thinking of DEPA as a traditional free trade agreement where you breach an obligation X and you face Y consequences, I think a better way of looking at it is let's build something based on which we can facilitate data flows within the region and within the three of us. And Henry identified very good reasons why these three economies wanted to come together, although they are parties to CPTPP as well as Singapore and New Zealand being parties to the RCEP. So there was this additional incentive to build a more collaborative structure that facilitates maybe perhaps more binding free trade agreements outside of the DEPA. And Henry also pointed out that this is not subject to, so the provisions on data flows are not subject to dispute settlement. And in fact, the annex also clearly specifies that the parties don't create any additional rights and obligations based on the provisions on data localization and data flows. So in that sense, I think if and when there is a dispute, these parties will fall back on the CPTPP or the RCEP. And because we don't know what the relationship between these different agreements will be, there is an acknowledgement that there could be a conflict and there will be a consensus-based resolution, but we don't know what that would be. And I also wonder what happens if a party wants to join a DEPA, but is not a member of CPTPP or RCEP or any of the other agreements that might tie these parties together. That's unclear. I also want, as a side note, I think it's commendable that DEPA has included the privacy provision within Module 4. It's a clear acknowledgement that privacy is a fundamental requirement for cross-border data flows. Of course, there are deficiencies, as Henry pointed out, with some of the elements of the data protection provision, but there is definitely a significant advancement over the CPTPP. And I think it is more aligned with the USMCA in that regard, where there's an acknowledgement of some basic principles of data protection, although nothing is binding, of course. And finally, let me end with this. Like, if you look at Module 4 in isolation on data issues, it doesn't do much more than what the CPTPP does, and also potentially creates conflicts with the RCEP. But At the same time, if you look at the module in context of the larger schematic of the DEPA, I think it creates a value addition, and it in that sense is going, I think it's as Deborah said at the beginning, it's going to be the fundamental basis on which digital trade frameworks are developed. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Neha. This was very useful, I think, to better understand really how DEPA approaches the issue of cross-border data flows. And I think that now what is important is we have discussed before at the very beginning, sort of like what the role and the governments, why they approach sort of this issue, building such a standalone agreement, sort of like what moved them. I think Henry clarified pretty well what were some of the defensive and offensive rationale that was behind the decision of governments to negotiate such a different type of agreement. But I think it would be interesting to really understand a little bit more, building on what Deborah also said at the very beginning, the business perspective on this agreement. And Stephanie, you have recently written actually a blog on Trade Experts on the DEPA, and you pointed out that the agreement emphasizes dialogue with the private sector. So I would like you, if you could elaborate a little bit more about sort of the relationship between the private sector and DEPA in terms of, you know, how beneficial can this agreement be for companies, especially in a way for SMEs, but not only for SMEs, and in a way sort of how do you think this dialogue between the private sector and the government can actually be enhanced in a way within DEPA?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Marta. You're right, there is this sort of business engagement element in that agreement, and there is actually, you know, among the range of innovative new provisions that are in the DEPA compared to what's gone before, this is certainly one of them. And I'll explain how important it is, but first, just by way of a bit of context, I think, you know, this agreement was negotiated very quickly, and usually, you know, for trade negotiators usually measure outcomes in terms of sort of years or maybe even decades, but this was only really 1 year's worth of negotiation. And I think it sort of responds to the context that it was negotiated in, because of course, we've seen, especially in the Asia Pacific, that digital is really ubiquitous. It's becoming the way that trade takes place, as well as, you know, of course, the way that we entertain ourselves and live and work and everything else. And COVID has really only served to sort of magnify and accelerate up that process. And so I think the DEPA is really, it's not just about businesses that are in the technology sector, you know, it's not just a video gaming company or a software designer, it's every business in the digital economy. And in fact, the way that the preamble sort of frames up this agreement is that this is trade in the digital economy, it's not digital trade as such. And, you know, even businesses that are domestically focused use essentially traded digital services, back office tools like you know, online accounting and so on. And in the post-COVID landscape, of course, as we've seen through the lockdowns and social distancing of the last, you know, 18 months, digital has helped a lot of that activity to continue and will be clearly quite critical in sort of revitalizing trade. So, you know, from a business perspective, the ideal is going to be able to make the best use of digital tools and digital ways of trading and digital goods and services as the things that are traded. And in order to do that well, what's needed is basically the sort of the biggest possible single digital marketplace, if you like, to operate in. So, you know, whether you're in e-commerce or gaming or professional services delivered digitally, what you want is sort of low cost, low transaction costs and sort of streamlined rules and certainty and predictability. Exactly as Debbie said, you know, businesses don't want a sort of deregulatory agenda here. They want clear guardrails, but also, you know, very predictable rules. So there's no scope for sort of capricious rulemaking or interpretation that of course adds costs when you're in business. And that's especially the case in e-commerce where, you know, as Debbie mentioned, it's all about small parcels trade, the margins are low, the cost per shipment is a really critical factor in whether your business succeeds or not. So things like e-payments and e-invoicing and digital ID and all the digital trade facilitation tools are absolutely critical there. But of course, what we've got right now is a very fragmented landscape, as the others have mentioned. But as well as that, I think there's a real disconnect between the way policymakers and all the very smart, very erudite people on this call might identify digital trade barriers compared to how business sees them. So some of the work that I've been involved with in the APEC context and through my work in New Zealand with businesses in the digital economy has really thrown up that some of the things that businesses care about are not necessarily what academics or economists or policymakers might see. So for instance, one of the biggest problems that the research I've seen has identified is ambiguity and inconsistency and a lack of streamlined, coherent standards, regulations, policies. This issue around interoperability, as Henry mentioned, is absolutely critical. If you can't have systems that talk to each other, that adds cost and red tape and difficulty. The privacy things are very important. Access to talent is crucial. And, a lot of the sort of issues around the sort of very nuts and bolts, kind of unglamorous mechanisms of trade are really what makes the difference. So that's where DEPA comes in. It is potentially, as the others have mentioned, the little snowball that could turn into the big snowball where everybody joins in, that could help to streamline a lot of those elements across the largest possible digital marketplace. And so as Debbie very articulately and comprehensively took us through some of those things that really matter to businesses, so things like e-payments, if you can't get paid in the digital economy, there's not going to be a lot of trade happening. Digital identities, which are also really critical for financial inclusion. Things like e-invoicing strip out huge amounts of cost and hassle, and are actually good for governments as well, because they increase transparency and tax collection and so on. So there's a lot in the DEPA that actually streamlines and takes out those costs from trade, whichever part of digital trade you're talking about. But what we need now is for more economies to join, and that the sort of the model, which actually in fact started with New Zealand and Singapore doing an FTA way back in 2000 and then has gradually accreted up to CPTPP, I think is something that the originators of this agreement actually deliberately, wanted it to become. They want it, as Debbie said, to be modules to be used as a sort of gold standard, the model modules, that's a tongue twister, but also for other countries to dock into DEPA and grow it into a sort of a bigger rule. And I think it's unfortunate from a business perspective that we are now starting to see heterogeneity in digital economy agreements. So Singapore is negotiating with, it's done a really very, very high standard agreement with Australia that's part of the bilateral FTA, so kind of a closed set, but it's also negotiating with the UK, with Korea. I read recently with Vietnam as well. And you can see that even if each individual agreement might be gold standard, if they're all, there are nuances and differences in the way that they apply, that's actually creating the sort of the digital noodle bowl, to, hark back to Bhagwati. It's creating essentially impediments to this sort of streamlined universal thing. But business can help to sort of fix that, I guess, because one of the provisions, as you mentioned, is this idea of a business dialogue, a very close kind of co-design process with stakeholders. And so there's a module about SMEs that makes provision for something that's already in CPTPP, which is that the parties all need to set up a website with information. Of course, that's a benefit to every business and every policymaker and every academic, but it's good for small businesses too, to be able to access this information, because that's one of the sort of identified challenges for businesses in this space, transparency and certainty. But as well as that, there's this dialogue where essentially businesses can engage with policymakers and with each others across the region to understand better. Because one of the features of the digital economy, of course, is this rapid transformation. So we're seeing new technologies, as the others have mentioned, AI and fintech, but also conceivably we can see other elements being brought in, and there's a mechanism to do that. So the sky's the limit, but maybe we'll see things like, I don't know, cryptocurrencies or blockchain or whatever it might be being brought in. And business and the people at the coalface, if you like, to hark back to a very old economy metaphor there, are able to essentially help inform policymakers about what matters, how these business models work, where the impediments actually are, what is the point of friction that needs to be addressed, and vice versa. Because I think also for policymakers, these are kind of hard communities to engage with. There's no nice, industry body for the digital economy. It's every business, and particularly in the services space, a lot of those businesses are not the easiest to engage with compared to some other sectors. So I think that's one of the innovations that's actually really powerful. This sector, more than any other, needs close engagement with the business community, and DEPA gives that sort of systemized, formalized framework for that.
Thank you very much. That was excellent, and it really gave us, I think, a good understanding, a better understanding of where we were at the beginning of the webinar of what the agreement is. And now I've already seen that there are some questions from the audience, so I will directly sort of go through some of them. I think there is one in particular that I think may be directed to Henry, but I presume sort of others are more than welcome to chip in. And it concerns so the fact that even if it does not include market access commitments, does DEPA create preferential treatment at all? If so, how can the party justify a violation of their WTO GATS MFN obligation, given that the agreement does not seem to fit into Article 5 exception? Henry, do you want to address this, or anyone else?
Yes, thank you, Marta, and thanks to my old friend, Professor Gabriel Gary, for raising this really interesting question. I suggest, I think that this question is of a particular interest for lawyers. So thank you for raising that. My response is twofold. First of all, I mean, if you look at the agreement itself, it actually explicitly addressed this issue in Article 1.2 on relation to the other agreements. So the DEPA affirms that the obligation under the DEPA is supposed to coexist with its existing obligations and other agreements. So to the extent that it is inconsistent with the provisions of another agreement, then the parties would consult with each other. So I think the intention here is to avoid any potential conflict with their other international obligations, including those under the WTO. And second, would this really create some conflict with WTO rules such as MFN rules? I'm not so sure, because I mean, the typical case where you find an MFN violation would be, for example, where you provide a preferential market access treatment, like what you find under most FTAs or ERAs for services. But if you look at the DEPA really doesn't see, for example, that for this and that sector, we grant additional access to New Zealand providers or Chilean providers. Instead, it is mostly about a domestic regulation, in the digital trade sector. And when it comes to domestic regulations, I mean, it is basically kind of one set of rules for everyone. If, let's say, any of the members of the DEPA have to change their existing rules because of the DEPA, they are going to change it for everyone, not just for the DEPA participants. I mean, it's not like, where you find in some of the laws in Singapore, for example, in the banking laws and laws regulating the legal sector, where they have actually specific market access commitments depending on the FTA partner. For example, when the EU signed FTA with Singapore, they added annex to the legislation, which says for EU firms, you get additional market access. You do not have to comply with this and that requirement. But DEPA doesn't include that. You know, on that basis, I would say the DEPA probably would not run into conflict with the WTO obligations, largely because most of the obligations are relating to domestic regulation and they apply across the board. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else wants to add something on this point, or we have other questions? We can proceed. Okay. Apologies. Another question concerns sort of the in a way the experience of the P3 P4 agreement. So a question asks the fact that DEPA was modeled on the P3 P4 agreement, and in a way sort of they ask what did New Zealand, Singapore, and Chile learn from that experience, and how did they apply that experience when negotiating DEPA? Deborah, would you like to answer this question?
Sure, I think it's great. I think it's a great question, and it's an important insight. So how did we end up with the CPTPP, which is currently 11 signatories, 7 are active, 1 more negotiating to join right now? We started with 3. So they started with actually the same 3 that we have in DEPA, and then built over time from P3 to P4, and then P4 to P7 to P9 to P11 to P12, back to 11, and now back up to 12. So this whole expansion is the way that these 3 countries said, let's try that on digital trade, which is, we know that we've made a lot of rules in TPP, and I mentioned what some of those were. Those rules were preserved as the transition from TPP to CPTPP. But then, because it had been kind of a long time, there's scope for additional rules in the digital space. And so the same countries that came together in the first place to launch that evolution to the CPTPP said, couldn't we replicate that in the digital space? Couldn't we create a modular agreement that is flexible enough to allow other members to join, because it will not conflict necessarily with existing commitments elsewhere, but it creates that consistent baseline, and we could build out sort of bottom up commitments around these sets of modules. And then we could take those modules again, as I mentioned, and put them elsewhere. So it was using that P3 evolution model to say, couldn't we create some really interesting digital trade commitments that would apply to a different set of countries? Not everyone wants to join TPP. Not everyone wants to join the JSI itself. Couldn't we create a digital economy agreement that has key elements embedded in it? You join the whole thing, or you take pieces of it. And the point is, let's make this sort of a potential anchor for lots of existing replicated commitments elsewhere. Now, of course, as Stephanie mentioned, that could be a real problem. If you're not taking a module in whole, and the module itself is flexible, so we're taking a flexible module and we're putting it in another setting with a different set of rules around it, with maybe expanded parts and shrunk parts, is that really helpful for business? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, I know that the officials would say, absolutely, that's incredibly helpful, it's alignment, et cetera. But from a business perspective, if you're not taking the whole module as it is and replicating it, you're taking part of the module, replicating it, stretching it, adjusting it, et cetera, less helpful for business. Because then I got to say, well, okay, I understand that the idea is there. You're going to discuss whatever the idea is, payments or whatever, but the rules are different. And the whole point of this for businesses is, can we make consistent rules? And so the idea by policymakers, let's just build out. But for business, unless we're making replicable commitments in different settings, then the net result might not be as favorable as you might have thought, given the argument behind why this modular approach makes sense.
Please, Stephanie. Yes.
I could not agree more with Debbie on that analysis. I'd just also add that I think that model is part of a strategy that New Zealand, as a very small player in global trade and very distant from markets, you know, no economic heft, we can't get out the gunboats if we don't have our way. It's part of the strategy that New Zealand has adopted across a range of different trade issues called concerted open plurilateralism. And I think it's, you know, it's more important than it certainly was back in the days of you know, in 2006 when the sort of TPP process really got going, because you know, we've seen this turning away from sort of multilateralism and global approaches to things, but this model allows countries that have a disposition towards working together and trying to sort of build, you know, creative ideas together. It allows them to sort of gradually build up the momentum. And so you can see a sort of parallel process that New Zealand is involved with, for instance, in the sort of trade and environment space, this agreement called the ACTS, Agreement on Climate Change, Trade and Sustainability, again, which has started with quite a small group of, you know, quite diverse economies, but the idea is that it can gradually grow over time as more countries see the wisdom or the creativity or the applicability of the rules. And likewise, there's a similar trade and gender arrangement, not a treaty level agreement, but an arrangement with Canada and Chile. So I think in these times when, you know, the whole question of what is the global architecture for trade is kind of, you know, a little bit more shaky than it has been for the last 20 years, it's quite a useful model just as a sort of piece of policy making as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we only have a few minutes left, a couple of minutes left for maybe another quick 2 questions. I think there is one directed at NEA, I think, that talks about exceptions from data localization requirements that is not regulated in DEPA and it's left open. So the question is the reason for this to ensure a greater policy convergence between countries, or for them to regulate this on their own, or maybe for the WTO exceptions in GATT 20 or GATT 14 articles to be invoked? In 1 minute, maybe?
Okay, so I think Henry already mentioned about Article 1.2. So obviously the WTO exceptions will continue to apply to all the DEPA parties. So definitely GATT Article 14 or GATT Article 20 continue to be relevant. In terms of leaving it open, part of it could have just been a pragmatic approach to accommodate the regulatory heterogeneity amongst the parties. I mean, if I think of one issue, online censorship, I'm pretty sure these 3 countries would have very different approaches. And we know censorship policies can also be a trade barrier at least on certain occasions, but could be also a legitimate public policy objective. So yeah, I think, yeah, in 1 minute, I think that's what I can answer, yeah.
Thank you very much. And then I think the last question that I will pose to anyone who is interested in answering this is, considering the different levels of development of the member countries and potential countries to join the agreement, considering that there is an accession provision in the agreement, what are some of the development considerations or provision in the agreement, if any? Who wants to chip in?
I'll take a stab at it. So there aren't any explicit development commitments in here. There's no sort of special treatment. It just say this is the agreement. But I think that's where the pragmatism and policy flexibility come from. The argument is if you aim too high, then you're not going to have this agreement expand out. If you aim too low, then there's no utility in it. So they're trying to be pragmatic in where do we pitch each of these modules. And the idea behind the module, I think for the members that created this, is let's think realistically about where we expect our local colleagues to be, and then try to make it so that it's useful, it's relevant, it has utility, but is also possible for others to join, especially those who would not join, for example, CPTPP. Let's create some kind of modules that are pragmatic and flexible, and eventually start to socialize others in the region meaning around me, that would join this agreement, that would find value in it as well, and build up those conversations so that we get digital trade at the end of the day. So it's a purely pragmatic, flexible, not specifically about development, but the idea is if you can't engage in that kind of conversation, then you're going to miss out on some of development. So let's bring along a whole variety of countries, and at the end of the day, we're all headed in the same general direction.
Someone else wants to add on this point? Okay, so I think we are really 1 minute left. So I would really like to thank you again for coming today, for participating in this webinar. I'm extremely grateful to our 4 panelists who have been amazing and I think gave us really a better understanding and a little bit of an overview of DEPA that possibly has inspired all the attendees to learn a little bit more and to dig a little bit more into the agreement. Trade Policy Exchange organizes other events related to digital trade. The next event will be on the European digital trade policy agenda. And it will be after the summer break. So please follow Trade Policy Exchange on Twitter and LinkedIn, where you will find the information. And again, thank you very much for participating in these events. And I wish all of you a very good evening, good morning, rest of the day. And thank you again for joining in. Greatly appreciated.
Thank you, Marta.
Thank you, Marta.
Thanks so much.